There are men who fight wars with a consistency and a competence that should have made them famous, whose records of service under the most extreme conditions that modern warfare has ever produced should have secured them a permanent place in the histories that get written afterward, and who instead disappear into the footnotes, remembered only by specialists and by the dwindling number of people who fought alongside them. Herbert Otto Gille is one of those men. He commanded Waffen SS formations on the Eastern Front for the most brutal years of the most brutal war in human history. He received every major military decoration that Nazi Germany could bestow, including the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of only 27 men in the entire German armed forces to receive that decoration across the entire duration of the war. He fought at Kharkov and Kursk and in the Cherkassy pocket and at Budapest. He held positions that should have been impossible to hold, conducted withdrawals that should have been impossible to conduct, and kept his formations fighting with an effectiveness that his opponents acknowledged even when they could not stop him. And then the war ended, Germany lost, and Herbert Otto Gille spent the rest of his life as a nobody in a defeated country, dying in 1966 with his decorations in a box and his story untold. This is that story. Herbert Otto Gille was born on March 8, 1897, in Gandersheim, a small town in Lower Saxony that had been part of the Duchy of Brunswick before German unification, and that in 1897 was the kind of quiet, provincial, thoroughly German place that produced men with a particular attachment to order and tradition, and the kind of straightforward patriotism that does not interrogate itself very deeply. His father was a civil servant. His family was respectable and middle class in the way that German families of that era understood respectability, and his childhood gave no particular indication of the military career that was coming. He was educated in the conventional way, attended the local schools, and was 17 years old when the First World War began in August 1914 and transformed everything. He volunteered for military service almost immediately, as enormous numbers of young German men did in the summer of 1914, when the war began with a wave of enthusiasm and patriotic fervor that nobody who lived through what followed could ever fully explain to people who had not been there. He was assigned to the artillery, which would remain his primary technical specialty throughout his military career, and which gave him a foundation of technical knowledge and an understanding of fire support and combined arms operations that would prove enormously valuable in the years to come. He served on the Western Front through the grinding years of trench warfare that consumed the generation of 1914, surviving the Somme and Verdun, and the campaigns of 1917 and 1918 that reduced the German army from the force that had swept through Belgium and France in the opening months of the war to something that was still fighting with extraordinary discipline and effectiveness, but that was being worn down by a coalition of enemies it could not defeat. He was commissioned as an officer during the war, which in the German army of that period required demonstrated ability and leadership under combat conditions, rather than simply the right family connections or educational credentials. He ended the war as a lieutenant, having served for 4 years in conditions that killed or permanently damaged most of the men who went through them. He came out the other side into the same shattered Germany that produced the political crisis of the Weimar years. The empire was gone. The army had been reduced by the Versailles Treaty to 100,000 men, and Gille was among those who left the military in the post-war period, spending the Weimar years in civilian life without the dramatic political involvement that characterized men who would later become prominent in the Nazi movement. He rejoined the military structures in the 1930s as the Nazi regime began its systematic expansion of German military power in defiance of the Versailles restrictions. He joined the SS rather than the regular army, which was a choice that reflected either ideological conviction or a calculation about where opportunities for advancement lay, or some combination of both that is difficult to disentangle from the historical distance of 80 years. The SS was expanding rapidly in the mid-1930s as Himmler built it from a political organization into something that increasingly resembled a parallel military force, and it was actively recruiting men with First World War military experience and officer credentials who could provide the professional military backbone that the SS needed as it transitioned from street fighting to something closer to conventional military organization. Gille brought to the SS exactly what it needed from men of his background. He was a professionally trained artillery officer with 4 years of combat experience on the Western Front, technically competent in ways that the younger SS men who had grown up after the war were not, and he had the kind of steady, undemonstrative leadership style that was effective in military organizations, even if it did not produce the charismatic personal following that some of the more dramatic SS figures cultivated. He was given artillery commands within the SS formations being built up through the late 1930s, and performed in those roles with the quiet competence that would characterize everything he did for the next decade. When the war began in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, Gille's SS formations were part of the force that overran the Polish army in less than a month, in a campaign that demonstrated the effectiveness of the new German way of war. The campaign in France and the Low Countries in May and June 1940 provided a more extended test. The German offensive that began on May 10, 1940, shattered the Allied defensive plan within days and sent French and British forces into a retreat that ended at Dunkirk for the British, and in the armistice of June 1940 for the French. Gille adapted to the fast-moving offensive conditions that suited German tactics with the mental flexibility that distinguished officers who were genuinely good at their profession from those who were merely technically competent. The invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22, 1941, was the campaign that would define Herbert Otto Gille's military career and consume the next 4 years of his life. Operation Barbarossa opened with 3 million German soldiers attacking along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, driving into Soviet territory with a momentum that, in the first weeks and months, seemed to confirm Hitler's prediction that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly once the pressure was applied. Gille's SS formations were part of this advance, and he performed with consistent effectiveness through the opening phase of Barbarossa as the Germans swept through Ukraine and the Western Soviet Union. But the campaign that had opened with such momentum began to slow in the autumn as the distances lengthened, the supply lines stretched, and the Soviet forces demonstrated a capacity for resistance and recovery that the German planners had not adequately anticipated. By December 1941, the advance on Moscow had stalled, and Soviet counterattacks pushed the Germans back from the outskirts of the capital. It was clear that the quick victory Hitler had promised was not coming, and that the war in the East was going to be something far longer and far more costly than anyone in the German High Command had planned for. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was catastrophic for the German forces in the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht and SS formations alongside it had not been equipped or prepared for winter warfare at the temperatures that the Russian winter produced, and the combination of Soviet counterattacks, extreme cold, and supply failures produced a crisis that came close to destroying the German position in the east entirely. The German forces held their positions through the winter at enormous cost, and when the spring of 1942 came and mobile operations resumed, the army that resumed those operations was significantly weaker than the one that had crossed the Soviet border 9 months earlier. Gille came through the first winter of the Eastern Front with his reputation intact and his command capabilities confirmed by the most demanding conditions that military service could produce. He was given command of an SS infantry regiment, moving from his artillery background into the direct command of combined arms formations that would characterize the rest of his career. This transition from artillery specialist to combined arms commander was not automatic or guaranteed, and the fact that Gille made it successfully reflected both his professional abilities and the kind of tactical intelligence that distinguished genuinely good commanders from men who were effective only in the specific role they had been trained for. The men who served under him in this period described a commander who was present at the front when the situation demanded it, who made decisions quickly and stuck to them, who did not ask his soldiers to take risks he was unwilling to take himself, and who communicated a steadiness under pressure that was contagious in the way that good leadership always is when it is genuine rather than performed. The battles around Kharkov in 1942 and 1943 were among the most significant engagements on the Eastern Front, and they made Herbert Otto Gille's reputation as a combat commander. Kharkov was the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union, and it changed hands multiple times during the war, each change of hands involving fighting of extraordinary intensity and cost. The German recapture of Kharkov in March 1943, the Third Battle of Kharkov, was one of the most tactically brilliant German operations of the entire war. The context was the aftermath of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army had been encircled in November 1942 and had surrendered in February 1943. The greatest single German defeat of the war, and a catastrophe that fundamentally changed the strategic situation on the Eastern Front. The Soviet forces that had encircled and destroyed the Sixth Army were advancing aggressively westward, and in the confusion and momentum of their advance, they had created a situation where the German front in the south had gaps and vulnerabilities that a more cautious opponent might have exploited more effectively. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein identified those vulnerabilities and organized a counterattack that used the SS Panzer Corps, including Gille's formation as the primary striking force. The counterattack was a masterpiece of mobile warfare. The SS Panzer formations drove into the flanks of the overextended Soviet advance, cutting off and destroying Soviet units that had advanced too far without securing their flanks, and then drove on Kharkov itself, retaking the city in fighting that was brutal, even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Gille's regiment was in the middle of this fighting, attacking through urban terrain against Soviet forces that contested every building and every street, and performing with the kind of sustained aggressive effectiveness that earned him his first major decorations and established him as one of the outstanding combat commanders in the SS order of battle. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, and it failed. The German plan at Kursk was to pinch off a large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk, using simultaneous attacks from the north and south, destroying the Soviet forces inside the salient and shortening the German front line in the process. the Soviets had extensive intelligence about the German plan and used the months of preparation time to build defensive lines of extraordinary depth and density that the German armored formations could not break through quickly enough before Soviet strategic reserves were committed and the offensive was called off. Gille's formations were part of the southern pincer that came closer to achieving its objectives than the northern pincer, but ultimately failed to break through. The failure at Kursk was a turning point that everyone involved understood at the time, and the months that followed were a grinding, costly defensive struggle that tested the German formations and their commanders in ways that the offensive operations of the earlier years had not. It was in this defensive phase of the war that Gille's qualities as a commander became most clearly visible. Offensive operations in favorable conditions reward aggression and tactical boldness, qualities that many commanders possess. Defensive operations against a numerically superior enemy that holds the initiative require something more difficult. They require the ability to make correct decisions under extreme pressure with inadequate resources, to identify the moments when a limited counterattack can stabilize a deteriorating situation, to maintain the cohesion and fighting effectiveness of formations that are taking heavy casualties and receiving inadequate replacements, and to keep going when every rational calculation suggests that the situation is hopeless. Gille was exceptionally good at this kind of warfare, and the battles of 1943 and 1944 proved it repeatedly. He was given command of the 5th SS Panzer Division, Viking, in the autumn of 1943, one of the premier armored formations in the SS order of battle, composed largely of volunteers from the occupied and allied countries of Western Europe, Scandinavians, Dutch, Flemish, and other nationalities who had volunteered to fight for what the SS presented as a pan-European crusade against Bolshevism. The Viking Division had a distinguished combat record from the earlier years of the Eastern Front campaign, and Gille inherited a formation that was already effective and experienced. Under his command, it became something more, a formation that consistently performed at the highest level in the most demanding conditions, and that became one of the most respected and feared German armored formations on the Eastern Front, from the Soviet perspective, as well as the German one. The Cherkassy pocket in early 1944 was the engagement that brought Gille to the attention of the German High Command and the German public in a way that his previous achievements had not quite managed. Soviet forces encircled 2 German Army corps in a loop of the Dnieper River in January 1944, trapping approximately 60,000 German and Allied soldiers in a pocket that the Soviets intended to reduce in the same way they had reduced the Stalingrad pocket a year earlier. Hitler ordered the encircled forces to hold their positions and declared Korsun a fortress city, and the German High Command organized a relief attempt that would attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement from outside while the trapped forces attempted to break out from inside. Gille's Viking Division was the spearhead of the relief force. The conditions in which he had to operate were about as difficult as anything the Eastern Front produced. It was the middle of a Ukrainian winter, with temperatures well below freezing, roads that alternated between frozen solid and churned into deep mud, depending on the temperature, and Soviet defensive positions that had been organized specifically to stop a relief attempt that the Soviet commanders knew was coming. Gille drove his division through these conditions with a determination and a tactical skill that even his opponents acknowledged. He found weak points in the Soviet defensive lines, exploited them before they could be reinforced, kept his formation moving when the conditions and the resistance would have justified stopping, and got closer to the encircled pocket than most people on either side had expected any relief force to get. The relief attempt came agonizingly close to succeeding in the conventional sense of establishing a corridor to the pocket. On at least one night, the encircled soldiers could hear the artillery of the relief force and believed that rescue was within reach. But the corridor that was created was narrow and contested, and the Soviets committed enough reserves to keep it from being widened into something the encircled forces could move through safely. The breakout that the encircled forces attempted in mid-February 1944 was only partially successful, with significant numbers of men breaking through to German lines on foot after abandoning their heavy equipment, while others were killed or captured in the final desperate fighting. The debate about Cherkassy has continued among historians ever since, with German accounts emphasizing the numbers saved and Soviet accounts emphasizing the completeness of their victory. But what was not in dispute was that Gille's performance during the relief operation had been outstanding by any standard. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, joining the tiny group of only 27 men who held Germany's highest military decoration. He was given command of the 4th SS Panzer Corps in the summer of 1944, a promotion that reflected the recognition his performance at Cherkassy had earned him, and the continuing attrition of senior SS commanders that the Eastern Front was producing. Command of a corps was a significant step up from division command, requiring the management of multiple formations simultaneously and the coordination of operations at a scale that tested different abilities than the more direct leadership that division command involved. Gille demonstrated that he could operate effectively at this level as well, though the circumstances in which he exercised his corps command were about as difficult as anything that the war produced. The summer of 1944 saw Operation Bagration destroy Army Group Center in the most catastrophic German defeat of the entire war, worse even than Stalingrad in terms of forces destroyed and ground lost. Entire German armies were encircled and destroyed. The front collapsed across a width of hundreds of miles, and the Soviet advance moved so fast and so far that it fundamentally transformed the strategic situation on the Eastern Front in a matter of weeks. Gille's corps found itself dealing with the consequences of this collapse, fighting in Poland through the autumn of 1944 in conditions of constant crisis, where the operational situation changed faster than headquarters could track it, and where the ability to make rapid decisions with incomplete information was the essential quality that separated commanders who kept their formations intact from those who lost them. Budapest, in the winter of 1944 to 1945, was the last major engagement of Gille's military career, and in some ways the most dramatic and the most heartbreaking. The Hungarian capital had been encircled by Soviet forces in December 1944, trapping a garrison of approximately 70,000 German and Hungarian soldiers that Hitler refused to allow to break out, declaring Budapest a fortress city in the same way he had declared other encircled positions, fortress cities throughout the war. The garrison fought in the ruins of the city through December and January, while the German High Command organized relief attempts from outside. Gille's 4th SS Panzer Corps was given the primary responsibility for breaking through the Soviet encirclement. The first relief attempt in January 1945 got to within 20 kilometers of the city before being stopped by Soviet forces that had anticipated the direction of the German attack and positioned their reserves accordingly. A second attempt in mid-January, using a different axis of advance, also failed to break through, though it got closer than the first attempt, and for a brief period created genuine hope in the German High Command that the relief might succeed. A third attempt in February 1945 got to within 20 kilometers again before Soviet pressure forced it back. Throughout these operations, Gille pushed his corps as hard as it was possible to push formations that were understrength, inadequately supplied, and operating in winter conditions against an enemy that held every strategic advantage. He was at the front constantly during these operations, personally directing the critical engagements, making the kind of snap decisions under fire that determined whether an attack succeeded or stalled, doing everything that a corps commander could do to will his formations forward. The encircled garrison could hear his artillery on more than one occasion and believed each time that relief was coming. It never came. In February 1945, the Budapest garrison, reduced by weeks of fighting to a shadow of its original strength, attempted a breakout that failed catastrophically, with only a small fraction of the men involved reaching German lines. The failure to relieve Budapest was not a reflection on Gille's performance or the performance of his corps. They had done what was operationally possible against an enemy that held every advantage. The fundamental problem was not the quality of the German commanders, but the strategic situation that made the relief of Budapest, like the defense of the Eastern Front more generally by early 1945, a task that exceeded what was militarily achievable, regardless of the quality of the men attempting it. The final months of the war saw Gille's corps fighting in Hungary and Austria as the Soviet advance continued westward, and the German position finally collapsed completely. The Lake Balaton offensive in March 1945, the last major German armored offensive of the war, involved Gille's corps, and like everything else the Germans attempted in those final weeks, it achieved initial success before being overwhelmed by Soviet counterattacks that the exhausted and understrength German formations could not contain. By April 1945, the war was effectively over, and the only question was how and where the surviving formations would surrender. Gille surrendered to American forces in May 1945, which was the outcome that most German soldiers on the Eastern Front had hoped for. He was held in American captivity for several years as the Allied powers worked through the complex process of investigating and prosecuting war crimes committed by German military formations. The question of war crimes committed by Gille's formations is one that historians have addressed with varying conclusions. The Viking Division and the 4th SS Panzer Corps operated in areas and during periods when atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war were committed by German forces, and the command responsibility for those atrocities is not always easy to establish at the individual level. Gille himself was not prosecuted for war crimes and was released from captivity in the late 1940s, returning to civilian life in West Germany. He spent the rest of his life living quietly in the Federal Republic, participating in veterans organizations and the network of former Waffen SS men who maintained connections with each other through the post-war years. He contributed to the revisionist narrative of the Waffen SS as a purely military organization whose fighting performance should be evaluated separately from the crimes of the broader SS empire, a narrative that historians have largely rejected, but that had considerable currency among veterans and their supporters in the 1950s and 1960s. He was not a prominent public figure in post-war Germany, and made no attempt to rehabilitate himself in the way that some former senior military figures did through memoir writing or public commentary on the war. Herbert Otto Gille died on December 26, 1966, in Stemmen, Lower Saxony, not far from where he had been born 69 years earlier. He died as a private citizen in a country that had no official place for men of his background and service, in a political culture that was still working through the enormously complex process of coming to terms with what Germany had done during the Nazi years. He died largely forgotten outside the circles of veterans and military history enthusiasts who maintained an interest in the operational details of the Eastern Front campaign. The question of how to assess Herbert Otto Gille is one that does not have a simple answer. He was by any objective measure an exceptionally capable military commander who performed at the highest level in the most demanding conditions that modern warfare has produced. His record on the Eastern Front, from the opening of Barbarossa through the defensive battles of 1943 and 1944 to the relief attempts at Cherkassy and Budapest, represents a consistency of military effectiveness that very few commanders on any side of the Second World War matched. The decorations he received, including the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds that only 26 other men in the entire German armed forces ever received, reflect a genuine and documented record of military achievement rather than political favor. But he commanded formations within an organization that was part of a regime engaged in crimes against humanity on a scale that has no parallel in modern history. The formations he commanded operated in the same geographic and temporal space as those crimes. The soldiers he led were members of an organization whose other formations were operating extermination camps and conducting mass shootings and implementing the racial ideology of the Nazi state through methods of organized murder. The separation between the military Waffen SS and the criminal SS that veterans argued for after the war is a distinction that the historical record does not fully support, even if the specific question of individual command responsibility is genuinely complicated. He was a soldier of extraordinary capability who served a criminal regime. He was a commander who kept his men fighting in conditions that should have broken them, who showed personal courage and tactical brilliance across 4 years of the most intense combat in history, and who did all of this in the service of a cause that history has judged with a clarity that was perhaps harder to achieve in the moment. He died forgotten because the country he fought for had been defeated and destroyed, because the regime he served had been exposed as criminal in ways that made celebrating its military achievements politically and morally impossible, and because the history of the Second World War, for entirely understandable reasons, has tended to focus on the crimes rather than the military details of the campaigns in which those crimes were embedded. His name deserves to be known, not because he deserves celebration, but because the story of the Eastern Front cannot be fully understood without understanding the men who fought it on both sides, and Herbert Otto Gille was one of the most significant of those men. He fought from the first day of Barbarossa to the last weeks of the war. He never lost a battle that he was given the resources to fight on anything approaching equal terms, and he died forgotten in a small town in Lower Saxony, with his decorations in a box and his story untold. Now you know it.